Welcome back to the Wasteland, Survivor. My name is on every Legion kill list from here to Flagstaff, but I am still here to tell the tale. This is the story of how Caesar's Legion was transformed from within by the one man they tried to kill. By the burned man himself, Joshua Graham. 3 months ago, a figure wrapped in bandages walked through our gates at midnight, and half the Legion fell to their knees without being ordered. I have served Caesar for 20 years as the greatest of his Frumentarii, orchestrating massacres and burning settlements to ash. But when Joshua Graham began preaching, even I felt my faith waver. He quoted scripture while burning away our Legion marks, baptizing us in fire as he himself was baptized. He knew every Legionnaire's name, their tribes, their histories before Caesar conquered them. The transformation was not violent. It was voluntary. It spread through our ranks like faith, like infection, like the inevitable dawn. And if you genuinely enjoy this kind of dark storytelling, consider subscribing and liking the channel, but only if you like the content. My name is Vulpes Inculta. For 20 years, I have served Caesar as the greatest of his Frumentarii. I have orchestrated massacres, poisoned wells, burned settlements to ash. I have walked through NCR camps wearing their uniforms, learning their secrets, becoming their nightmare. I thought I understood fear. I thought I understood power. Then, 3 months ago, the burned man walked through our gates at Fortification Hill, and I learned I understood nothing. It was midnight when he arrived. I was returning from a reconnaissance mission to Camp Golf when I saw him at the main gate. The sentries had their spears raised, but they were frozen, not from discipline, from terror. He wore bandages wrapped around every inch of skin, yellowed with age and stained with something dark. Over the bandages, he wore what looked like fragments of pre-war tactical gear, scorched black. His eyes were the only thing visible, and they burned with an intensity that made looking at him feel like staring into the sun. The guards demanded his name. He spoke one word, Malpais, the forbidden name, the name Caesar had ordered stricken from every tongue in the Legion. Joshua Graham, the first legate, the man Caesar had covered in pitch and set ablaze before throwing into the Grand Canyon, the man who should be dead. I watched from the shadows as Graham moved past the paralyzed guards. His footsteps made no sound. The bandages seemed to glow in the moonlight, white as bone, and where he walked, legionaries stopped what they were doing. Some fell to their knees, others backed away. A few of the younger ones, those who had only heard the stories, reached out as if to touch him, then pulled their hands back as if from flame. He walked directly to Caesar's tent. Lucius, Caesar's Praetorian commander, stepped into his path. Lucius is the most loyal man in the Legion, a warrior who would die for Caesar without hesitation. He raised his machete and told Graham that the burned man had no place here, that he should leave before blood was spilled. Graham looked at him, just looked, and Lucius lowered his blade. I saw his hand shaking. Graham spoke then, and his voice carried across the camp like wind through a canyon. He said he needed to see Edward, not Caesar, Edward. The name our leader had abandoned 30 years ago when he crowned himself. The intimacy of it, the familiarity, it cut through the myth of Caesar's divinity like a blade through silk. Caesar emerged from his tent. Even from where I stood, I could see he was different than he had been that morning. The tumor in his brain had been getting worse. He had been having more frequent headaches, blackouts that left him disoriented. But in that moment, facing the man he had tried to murder, Caesar stood straight, alert, almost afraid. The two men stared at each other across the firelight. Graham spoke first. He said he had come to offer Caesar a choice, repentance or damnation. Caesar laughed, but it sounded hollow. He ordered Graham's execution. 20 legionaries moved forward, and this is where I witnessed something I still cannot explain. Graham did not fight, did not move. The legionaries thrust their spears toward him, and the weapons turned soft in their hands. The iron melted like wax, dripping onto the sand, hissing as it cooled. The legionaries backed away, dropping their ruined weapons. One of them, a young decanus named Cursor, screamed. He said the bandages had burned him just from being close. I saw the blisters forming on his arms. Caesar ordered the execution stopped. He invited Graham into his tent. They spoke for 3 hours. I stationed myself outside, listening, but their voices were too low to make out words. When Graham emerged, Caesar followed him to the edge of camp. Caesar's face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool desert night. He watched Graham walk into the darkness beyond our perimeter, and then he turned to me. He knew I had been watching. Caesar knows everything. He told me Graham would return at dawn, and when he did, I was to observe, but not interfere. He said Graham had come to fulfill a prophecy, and that prophecy would either save the Legion or destroy it. Then Caesar went back to his tent and did not emerge for 2 days. Graham returned as predicted, just as the sun rose over the eastern hills. This time he walked to the center of camp, to the arena where we train and where we crucify our enemies. Legionaries were already gathering, drawn by something they could not name. Word had spread through the camp like wildfire. The burned man had returned, the first legate, the betrayer, the survivor. He began to preach. His words were not what I expected. He did not speak of vengeance or betrayal. He spoke of Mars, but not the Mars we knew, not the god of war that Caesar had taught us to worship. Graham spoke of a different Mars, the god of necessary change, the god of transformation through fire. He said we had been worshiping a lie, that Caesar had given us the god of conquest when we needed the god of rebirth. What do you think really happened here? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I would like to know if I am the only one who feels this way. He told us that the Legion was a chrysalis, that Caesar had built us to be something greater than we were, but that we had stopped short of transformation. He said the strong do not just conquer the weak, the strong serve something stronger, and he said that something stronger was coming, whether we were ready or not. The legionaries listened. At first there was anger, shouts of heresy, calls for his blood, but Graham kept speaking, and his voice had a quality that made men quiet. It was not loud, but it carried, it penetrated. Several of the older centurions, men who had fought under Graham before his fall, began to nod. I saw tears on their faces. Graham said he knew every man in the camp. He called out names. He spoke of tribes and families and the lives we had before Caesar took us. He told a young recruit named Vulpes about his mother, a woman from the Twisted Hairs who had sung to him before she died. He told Cursor, the Decanus who had tried to kill him, about his father, a chief who had surrendered to save his people and whom Caesar had crucified anyway. He told these stories with perfect detail, intimate knowledge that should have been impossible. Then he moved through the camp and began removing brands. The Legion marks every warrior with Caesar's bull, burned into flesh as a mark of ownership. Graham walked among the legionaries, and where he touched them, the scars vanished. He placed his bandaged hands on burned flesh, and the tissue healed clean and smooth. The men he touched fell to their knees weeping. Some of them vomited. Others laughed with a manic joy that bordered on hysteria. I reported this to Caesar immediately. I found him in his tent, holding his head, blood trickling from his nose. The tumor was getting worse. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to see through me, and he told me that Graham was not healing anyone. He was baptizing them, preparing them for what came next. I asked Caesar what came next. He told me that Joshua Graham had been touched by something beyond this world when he survived the fire, that the flames had burned away the man and left something else, a prophet, a messenger. Caesar said he had known this would happen, that he had thrown Graham into the fire, knowing he would survive, knowing what he would become. He said the Legion needed 2 fathers, one of law and one of spirit, one to build and one to sanctify. I did not believe him. I thought the tumor was making Caesar paranoid, delusional, but over the following days, I began to see things that made me question everything I knew. Graham stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. I watched him for 72 hours straight, and he never once sat down or closed his eyes. Legionaries would bring him water, and he would pour it on the ground, saying he was sustained by something they could not see. The water he poured turned the sand to mud, and in that mud, plants began to grow. Not wasteland scrub, but green things with broad leaves and white flowers that smelled like honey. Young legionaries began having visions. They would wake screaming in the night, talking about cities made of gold rising from radioactive ash. They described New Vegas burning, but from the flames came towers of crystal and streets paved with silver. They said they could see the future, and in that future, the Legion was not an army, but a nation, not conquerors, but builders. Caesar sent me to spy on Graham more closely. I disguised myself as a young recruit and joined the groups that gathered around him each evening. Graham looked at me the moment I approached and smiled. He said my name, my real name, the name I had before the Legion, the name I had not spoken in 15 years. He said I had always been a seeker, that I joined the Frumentarii not for glory, but because I needed to understand how things worked. He said that quality would either save me or damn me, but I would have to choose. He told stories about Caesar that no one should have known, private conversations, secret doubts. He described the moment when Edward Sallow decided to become Caesar, standing on a cliff overlooking the Grand Canyon, choosing to throw away his humanity for power. He described Caesar's first kill, a tribal elder who begged for mercy, and how Caesar's hands shook for 3 days afterward. He described the tumor, how it was not killing Caesar but transforming him, making him ready for a synthesis that neither man nor Legion fully understood. Lanius began attending Graham's sermons. The monster of the East, the man who had replaced Graham as legate, stood at the back of crowds and listened. His massive form was impossible to miss, and legionaries whispered nervously when they saw him. Lanius had built his reputation on absolute brutality, on following Caesar's orders without question or mercy. If he decided Graham was a threat, he could end this with one swing of his blade. But Lanius did not attack. He listened, and one night, after Graham finished speaking about honor beyond conquest, about the warrior's duty to protect rather than destroy, Lanius removed his helmet. I had never seen his face before. No one had. Beneath the iron and brass was a man younger than I expected, with scars that told stories of 100 battles. He looked at Graham and nodded once, just once. But in that gesture, I saw acknowledgement, maybe even respect. Graham was teaching selected centurions to read. This was forbidden. Caesar had banned literacy among the rank and file, saying it made men weak, made them question orders. But Graham was sharing texts with our officers, ancient books about philosophy and history and religion. I managed to glimpse one of these books. It was written in a language I did not recognize, symbols that seemed to shift and flow on the page. The centurion holding it said it was teaching him the true history of the world, the pattern beneath the chaos. The slaves reacted to Graham differently than anyone else. When he walked through their work areas, they did not cringe or bow. They watched him with something like pity. One of them, an older woman who had been captured from a farming settlement near the 188, told me that Graham was the most dangerous kind of prophet, the kind who meant every word he said. She said he would free them all, but not in the way they hoped. His freedom would burn hotter than any chain. Graham showed us his scars one night. He removed his bandages in front of 50 legionaries, and what we saw beneath made several men faint. His body was covered in burns, but the scar tissue had formed patterns, words, entire sentences written in flesh, in languages some recognized and others did not. One centurion who had studied with the followers of the apocalypse said the scars were prophecies, predictions of events that had not yet happened but would soon. He was building something beneath the camp. I followed him one night and watched as he dug with his bare hands, moving tons of sand and rock as if they weighed nothing. He created a chamber 30 feet below the surface and lined its walls with pieces of pre-war technology he had scavenged from the wasteland, circuit boards and wire and glass screens that flickered with green light. He said it was an altar, but it looked like a machine. When I asked what it was for, he told me I would understand when the time came. Then he looked at me with those burning eyes and said the time was coming soon. More legionaries began wearing bandages. At first just a few, wrapping their arms or faces in cloth stained with ash. Then dozens. Then hundreds. It was not from wounds, but from solidarity. They wanted to be like the burned prophet. They wanted to share his pain and his power. Caesar saw this and said nothing. I expected him to order it stopped, to punish those who imitated Graham, but he only watched with those tired eyes and smiled a smile that held no joy. Caesar's tumor continued to worsen. His blackouts became more frequent. Sometimes he would speak in languages none of us knew, or he would give orders for campaigns against enemies that did not exist. Lucius came to me privately and asked if I thought Caesar was dying. I told him I did not know. What I did not say was that I thought Caesar was not dying, but changing, becoming something none of us would recognize. Graham said the final battle was not with the NCR. He said the real war was internal, a conflict between what we were and what we could become. He said we had already lost the battle for Hoover Dam before it even began. That victory, measured in land and slaves, meant nothing. The true victory was in transformation, in choosing to become something better than what Caesar had made us. The younger legionaries believed him. The older ones were uncertain, but none of them moved to stop him. Even those who thought he was a heretic, even those who remembered him as a traitor, they could not bring themselves to act. There was something about Graham that made violence feel pointless, not because he was invulnerable, but because killing him would accomplish nothing. The change he spoke of was already happening, spreading through the Legion like radiation through water. Invisible, inevitable, lethal. I continued reporting to Caesar, but my reports became lies. I told him Graham was contained, that his influence was limited, that the Legion remained loyal. Caesar knew I was lying. We both knew, but he accepted the lies because the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. Graham had become too powerful to martyr. Half the Legion would revolt if Caesar ordered his execution. Maybe more than half. I began to see the Legion differently. What I had always viewed as strength now looked like brittleness. What I had seen as order now felt like chains. Graham had not changed the Legion through force or argument. He changed it by showing us what we already knew but had been too afraid to acknowledge, that Caesar's vision was incomplete, that conquest without purpose was just death with better organization, that we were all slaves to a dying man's dream, and that dream had become a nightmare. Graham performed miracles. He healed men dying of radiation sickness with nothing but prayer and touch. He made clean water flow from irradiated springs. He predicted events before they happened, like the NCR patrol that would stumble into our territory 3 days before they arrived, or the rad scorpion nest that would collapse and kill 6 slaves unless they were moved. The legionaries called him prophet, saint, demon. Caesar called him necessary. Asterisk, asterisk. The transformation was not violent. It was voluntary. It spread through our ranks like faith, like hope, like infection. Asterisk, asterisk, I started having dreams. This had never happened before. Frumentarii are trained to sleep lightly, to wake at the smallest sound, to keep our minds clear and focused. But Graham's arrival changed something in me. I would close my eyes and see visions that felt more real than waking life. In these dreams, I walked through a version of the Legion that did not exist yet. Fortification Hill had become a city of stone and metal, with towers that reached toward the sky. There were schools where children learned to read and write. There were hospitals where the sick were healed without slavery or suffering. The bull banners still flew, but they meant something different. Not conquest, protection, the strong defending the weak instead of devouring them. In these dreams, Caesar was dead, but the Legion lived on, stronger than before, and at the center of it all stood Graham, no longer wrapped in bandages, his burns healed into silver scars that caught the light like armor. He was building something that would outlast Rome itself. I woke from these dreams with my heart pounding and my hands shaking. I told no one, but I began to notice other legionaries acting strangely in the mornings, looking at each other with recognition, as if they had all walked through the same impossible future during the night. Graham's sermons became more specific. He stopped speaking in parables and metaphors. He named the corruption within the Legion by name and rank. He talked about centurions who raped slaves and called it their right. He spoke of the way we burned books and destroyed knowledge to keep our warriors ignorant. He described the waste of throwing away half our population by treating women as nothing more than breeding stock and labor. This should have gotten him killed. Caesar should have ordered him crucified for these words. But instead, Caesar attended one of these sermons. He came at dawn, leaning heavily on Lucius, the tumor making his legs weak and unsteady. He sat on a stone at the edge of the gathering and listened while Graham dissected everything Caesar had built. Graham spoke directly to Caesar that morning. He said Edward Sallow had been a brilliant man who made a terrible mistake. He thought he could use evil methods to achieve good ends, that he could build civilization through slavery and massacre. But evil methods create evil results, always, without exception. The Legion was powerful, yes, feared, yes, but it was also hollow. A machine designed for one purpose, conquest, with no plan for what came after. Caesar listened without interruption. When Graham finished, Caesar stood. The assembled legionaries held their breath. This was the moment where our leader would either embrace or execute the burned prophet. Caesar walked to where Graham stood and placed his hand on Graham's shoulder. The bandages did not burn him. He spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. He said that Joshua Graham was right about everything, every single word. Then Caesar collapsed. The tumor had finally won. He fell unconscious, blood pouring from his nose and ears, his body seizing. Lucius and the Praetorian Guard rushed him to his tent. The camp physician, a man named Silas, who had trained with the followers before joining the Legion, examined Caesar and delivered his prognosis. Without surgery, Caesar would be dead within a week. With surgery, he might survive, but the outcome was uncertain. Graham entered Caesar's tent uninvited. Lucius tried to stop him, but Caesar, conscious again but barely, waved the guard away. Graham knelt beside Caesar's bed and placed his bandaged hands on our leader's head. He did not heal him. He did not perform a miracle. Instead, he spoke quietly, words meant only for Caesar's ears. I was close enough to hear fragments. Something about choices and consequences. Something about the Legion needing to survive Caesar's death, not depend on it. Something about legacy. Caesar reached up and gripped Graham's wrist. He said something in return, too quiet for me to catch, but I saw tears on Caesar's face. Real tears. I had never seen Caesar cry. I did not think he was capable of it. Graham left the tent and announced that Caesar would undergo surgery, that the tumor would be removed, and that Caesar would survive or die by the will of Mars. Not the Mars of war, but the Mars of transformation. Then he did something that changed everything. He said that if Caesar died, the Legion would not fall apart. It would evolve. It would become what it was always meant to be. Lucius demanded to know what Graham meant. Graham smiled, and it was a terrible smile, full of love and sorrow and absolute certainty. He said the Legion was already evolving, that it had been since the moment he walked through the gates. He said the synthesis was happening whether Caesar lived or died, whether the NCR won or lost, whether any of us wanted it or not. The fire had been lit. It would burn until nothing remained but truth. Over the next 3 days, while Caesar lay in a coma waiting for surgery, Graham's influence spread beyond Fortification Hill. Legionaries at Cottonwood Cove reported seeing a figure wrapped in bandages walking through their camp at night, speaking to men who were on guard duty, telling them about a better way. Centurions at Nelson sent word that their slaves were refusing to work, saying that the burned man had promised them freedom soon. Reports came from as far as Flagstaff that young recruits were questioning orders, asking why the Legion did what it did, demanding answers their commanders could not provide. I was sent to investigate these incidents. What I found terrified me. Graham had never left Fortification Hill. I confirmed this with multiple witnesses. He had been in camp every night, visible to dozens of legionaries. Yet the reports were real. Men at Cottonwood Cove described him perfectly, down to the specific pattern of his bandages. Slaves at Nelson quoted words he had spoken that morning at Fortification Hill, words they should not have been able to know. When I reported this impossibility to Lucius, he did not seem surprised. He said Graham existed in multiple places at once, that the fire inside him had burned away the normal rules of flesh and space. He said this was a test from Mars, and we were failing it. The surgery happened on the 4th day. A courier had arrived with an autodoc component from Vault 34, a diagnostic scanning module that would allow the procedure to succeed. Caesar was moved to the machine, still unconscious, still bleeding from wounds that would not close. The entire camp gathered outside his tent, waiting. Graham did not watch the surgery. Instead, he walked to the chamber he had built beneath the camp, the strange altar made of pre-war technology. I followed him, drawn by something I could not name. Inside the chamber, the machines were humming, screens glowing with data that scrolled too fast to read. Graham stood in the center of it all and began to pray. His prayer was not in Latin or English. It was in that other language, the one written on his scars. As he spoke, the machines responded. The screens showed images. I saw Hoover Dam, but not as it was. I saw it transformed into something else, a symbol rather than a place. I saw the NCR and the Legion locked in combat, but their soldiers had no faces. I saw Mr. House in his tower, and he was laughing, and the laughter turned to screaming. I saw New Vegas burning and rebuilding, and burning again in an endless cycle. Then I saw myself, standing at a crossroads in the desert, alone, holding something in my hands that glowed like fire. Graham's voice echoed in the chamber, telling me I would have to choose soon, betrayal or faith, loyalty to Caesar or loyalty to truth, the old way or the new. He said there was no middle ground, no compromise, no safe path, only the choice. And whatever came after, Caesar survived the surgery. The tumor was removed, and against all probability, he woke up clear-headed and strong, stronger than he had been in months. The Legion celebrated. Lucius declared it a miracle of Mars. The legionaries sacrificed 6 slaves in gratitude. Their blood poured onto the sand as an offering. Graham said nothing about the surgery's success. He simply continued his work, teaching, preaching, transforming. More centurions came to him to learn to read. More legionaries removed their brands and replaced them with bandages. More slaves whispered about the prophet who would free them through fire. If you have ever wondered what choice you would make in a situation like this, tell me in the comments. I will be reading them. I began to notice patterns in Graham's teachings. He was preparing the Legion for something specific. He spoke often about the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, but not as a military engagement. He described it as a threshold, a moment when the Legion would have to choose between expansion and consolidation, between becoming an empire or remaining a horde. He said the choice had already been made, but most legionaries did not realize it yet. Lanius started speaking more openly with Graham. I watched them together one evening, the monster of the East and the burned prophet, discussing strategy and philosophy. Lanius asked Graham if he believed in victory. Graham said he believed in purpose. Victory was temporary. Purpose was eternal. Lanius nodded and said that he had won 19 campaigns for Caesar, had conquered tribes and territories, and made himself into a legend of brutality, and none of it had given him purpose. Only fear, only blood. Graham told Lanius that blood could be washed away, that legends could be rewritten, that even the monster of the East could choose to become something else. Lanius removed his helmet again and looked at Graham with eyes that held decades of violence and regret. He asked if redemption was possible for someone like him. Graham said redemption was possible for anyone, but the price was higher than most were willing to pay. You had to let the fire burn away everything you were to make room for what you could become. Lanius put his helmet back on and walked away. But the next morning, he gathered his personal guard and told them something that spread through the Legion like lightning. He said that when the battle for Hoover Dam came, they would fight not for conquest, but for survival. Not to destroy the NCR, but to prove the Legion deserved to exist. He said the old way of war was ending, and something new was beginning, and they would all have to adapt or die. Caesar called me to his tent 1 week after the surgery. He looked healthier than I had seen him in years. The tumor was gone, the headaches vanished, his mind sharp and clear, but there was something different in his eyes. A quality I had never seen before. Doubt, maybe, or wisdom. He asked me what I thought of Joshua Graham. I told him the truth. I said Graham was the most dangerous man in the Mojave, that he was dismantling everything Caesar had built without firing a single shot. I said half the Legion now followed Graham more than they followed Caesar, and the other half was uncertain. I said if Caesar wanted to stop this, he needed to act immediately. Execute Graham publicly and brutally. Make an example that would terrify anyone else who thought about questioning the Legion's purpose. Caesar listened to my analysis and smiled. He said I was absolutely correct. Graham was dismantling his Legion, and Caesar was allowing it, encouraging it even, because the Legion as it existed could not survive. It was a tool designed for a specific task, conquering the tribes and forging them into an army. But that task was nearly complete. The Legion controlled 87 tribes now. Almost all of the major settlements east of the Colorado had been absorbed or destroyed. The tool had done its work. Now it needed to transform into something else, or it would collapse under its own contradictions. He said he had always known this day would come. From the moment he threw Joshua Graham into the Grand Canyon, he knew the burned man would return. He had planned it, orchestrated it. The Legion needed a devil and a saint, a warrior and a prophet, a Caesar and a Christ, one to build and one to sanctify, one to conquer and one to teach what came after. I asked Caesar if he was saying he intended to let Graham take over the Legion. He laughed and said it was not about taking over, it was about synthesis, two opposing forces creating something new. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He had learned it from old books, from philosophers whose names were dust, but the principle remained true. The Legion and Graham's vision would collide at Hoover Dam, and from that collision, something unprecedented would emerge. Then Caesar told me something that made my blood turn cold. He said the tumor had not been an accident. He had been poisoning himself for 3 years, carefully introducing toxins into his food that would cause the exact symptoms he needed: the headaches, the blackouts, the appearance of dying. He had been staging his own mortality to prepare the Legion for life without him, because Caesar the man would die eventually, but Caesar the idea needed to be immortal, and ideas only became immortal when they evolved. I asked him if Graham knew about this deception. Caesar said Graham knew everything, always had. From the moment he survived the fire, Graham had been able to see through Caesar's plans as if they were written on glass. The two of them had been working together for 30 years, even when it looked like they were enemies. Especially when it looked like they were enemies. The conflict was necessary. The separation was required. You could not have resurrection without death. You could not have a prophet without a wilderness. You could not have transformation without fire. I left Caesar's tent feeling like the ground had dissolved beneath my feet. Everything I thought I knew was a performance, a play staged for an audience of thousands, with only 2 actors who knew the script: Caesar and Graham, Edward and Joshua, the son of Mars and the burned man, locked in a dance that had been choreographed before I was even born. I went to Graham and told him what Caesar had said. He was not surprised. He said Caesar was telling the truth, mostly. The tumor had been real, not manufactured, but Caesar had recognized it as an opportunity rather than a curse. He had used his illness to accelerate a transformation that would have taken decades otherwise. He had turned his weakness into the Legion's strength. But Graham also said Caesar was lying about one thing. He said the synthesis was not controlled. It was not planned. Caesar thought he could orchestrate the Legion's evolution like he orchestrated a military campaign with precision and discipline. But transformation was not a military operation. It was a wildfire. Once lit, it consumed everything in its path, including those who started it. Caesar had lit the fire by throwing Graham into the canyon. Now neither of them could stop what was coming. Graham looked at me with those burning eyes and said I would see the truth soon at Hoover Dam, where everything Caesar had built would be tested against everything Graham was teaching, where the Legion would either evolve into something new or collapse into something worse. where I would have to make my choice, standing at that crossroads he had shown me in his machines, holding the fire in my hands and deciding whether to nurture it or extinguish it. The preparations for battle intensified. Lanius gathered the legion's forces, coordinating strategies with his centurions. Supply lines were established. Scouts were sent to map the NCR positions. Weapons were sharpened. Legionaries trained in the arena, preparing for the fight that would determine the Mojave's future. But underneath the military preparations, something else was happening. Graham's teachings were spreading faster now, carried by legionaries who had become believers, who had seen the visions and heard the prophecies and decided the old way was not enough. They recruited others. They shared the forbidden texts. They spoke about a legion that protected instead of enslaving, that built instead of destroying, that offered purpose beyond conquest. Caesar watched this happen and did nothing to stop it. He attended Graham's sermons more frequently, sitting in silence while the burned prophet described a future that looked nothing like the empire Caesar had envisioned. Sometimes Caesar would nod, sometimes he would argue, but he never ordered it stopped. He was feeding the fire even as it consumed his creation. I realized that Caesar and Graham were both gamblers, playing a game with stakes too high to comprehend. They were betting that the Legion could transform before it destroyed itself, that the collision at Hoover Dam would forge something new instead of shattering everything into fragments. That synthesis was possible even when the opposing forces were this violent, this incompatible. But watching them, I began to suspect they were both wrong. Transformation was coming, yes. Change was inevitable, but it would not be controlled by Caesar's planning or Graham's prophecy. It would be chaotic, unpredictable, bloody. The fire they had lit would burn hotter than either of them expected, and when the ashes settled, the legion that emerged might not resemble anything either man had hoped for. The final days before Hoover Dam arrived like an approaching storm. The night before the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, Graham performed his final miracle at Fortification Hill. He gathered every legionary in camp, over 2,000 warriors, and told us to bring our weapons. Machetes, spears, firearms scavenged from fallen enemies. We laid them at his feet in a pile that rose taller than a man. Graham walked into the pile and sat down. The weapons should have cut him, should have pierced the bandages and drawn blood. Instead, they began to glow. A soft light, golden like sunrise, spread from Graham's body through the metal and wood. The glow intensified until we had to shield our eyes. When the light faded, the weapons had changed. Every blade was perfectly sharp. Every gun was cleaned and maintained as if fresh from a pre-war factory. But more than that, they felt different, lighter, balanced. When legionaries picked up their weapons, they reported feeling something moving through the metal into their hands. Purpose, some said, clarity. Others described it as fire that did not burn, a warmth that spread from their palms through their entire body. Graham stood and spoke his final sermon before battle. He said the weapons were blessed, but not in the way we understood blessing. They were not made more deadly. They were made honest. Every blow struck with these weapons would carry intention, would force the wielder to acknowledge what they were doing and why. There would be no mindless violence, no killing without purpose. The weapons would demand truth from those who used them. This terrified some legionaries. They were trained to kill without question, to follow orders without thought. Graham was asking them to become conscious warriors, to choose every action rather than simply obeying. Several dozen legionaries left their weapons in the pile and walked away. Graham let them go. He said the choice was always theirs to make. Lanius approached the pile and retrieved his massive blade, the weapon that had earned him the title Monster of the East. He held it up to the fading light and examined it carefully. Then he turned to his gathered forces and made an announcement that rippled through the legion like an earthquake. He said that when they crossed the river tomorrow, they would fight as men, not as monsters. They would show the NCR what the Legion could be when it fought for something beyond conquest. He said many of them would die, but their deaths would mean something more than expanding Caesar's territory. They would die, proving that change was possible, even for warriors forged in blood. Caesar emerged from his tent. He had been resting, conserving his strength for the battle to come. He looked at the transformed weapons, at the legionaries standing in uncertain groups, at Graham surrounded by that persistent glow that seemed to come from within rather than without. Caesar smiled, and for the first time since I had known him, it looked like a genuine smile rather than a calculated expression. He walked to Graham and embraced him. The entire camp fell silent. Caesar and Graham, Edward and Joshua, the son of Mars and the burned man, holding each other like brothers, reunited after a long separation. Caesar spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. He said that no matter what happened at Hoover Dam, the Legion had already won. Not the battle, something more important. The right to continue existing. The right to become something better than what it was. Then Caesar did something unprecedented. He removed the wreath of laurels from his own head and placed it on Graham's bandaged brow. He said that Joshua Graham was the true legate now, not in rank but in spirit, that Graham would lead the Legion into its future, while Caesar dealt with its past. He said the synthesis was complete, that the two of them had become one idea, even while remaining two men. Graham removed the laurels and handed them back. He said Caesar misunderstood. There was no leader in what was coming, no single authority. The Legion would have to learn to govern itself, to make choices collectively rather than following one man's will. The age of Caesars was ending. The age of citizens was beginning. It would be messy, chaotic, painful, but it would be honest. Caesar looked at Graham for a long moment, then he nodded and placed the laurels on the ground between them. Neither man picked them up. The symbol of authority lay abandoned in the sand, and somehow that felt more powerful than any coronation. I barely slept that night. When I closed my eyes, I saw the crossroads again, clearer than before. I stood in the desert holding a torch, and the torch was spreading fire in all directions. Behind me was the Legion as it had been, structured and brutal and efficient. Ahead of me was something I could not fully see, obscured by smoke and flame. To my left was the NCR, bloated and corrupt but alive. To my right was the wasteland, empty and free and terrifying. Graham's voice echoed in the dream. He said the choice was not about choosing a side in the battle. The choice was about choosing what I believed. Did I believe people could change? Did I believe the Legion could evolve into something worth serving? Did I believe that fire could cleanse without destroying? I woke with the answer burning in my chest. Yes, despite everything, despite the evidence of 20 years of massacre and slavery and cruelty, I believed. Not because it was logical, not because it was safe, but because the alternative was despair, and I had spent enough of my life serving despair. The Legion marched to Hoover Dam at dawn. Thousands of warriors moving in perfect formation, their blessed weapons gleaming in the early light. Lanius led the vanguard. Caesar rode near the middle, strong but visibly tired. Graham walked at the rear, alone, his bandages brilliant white against the red desert. I took my position with the Frumentarii, assigned to infiltrate NCR positions and gather intelligence. But as we approached the dam, I found myself slowing, falling back until I walked beside Graham. He glanced at me and smiled. He said he had been waiting for me to make this choice, that he knew I would eventually stop pretending to be neutral. I asked him what would happen at the dam. He said he did not know exactly. The future was not fixed. It depended on choices not yet made, by people not yet ready to make them, but he could see the shape of it, the outline. Blood would be spilled, heroes would fall. The NCR and Legion would clash in a battle that neither side could truly win, and in the chaos, something new would be born. He said the dam itself was a symbol, water and power, flowing through a structure built by the old world. Both sides wanted to control it, thinking control of the dam meant control of the Mojave. But neither side understood that the dam was already broken, not physically, but conceptually. The old world built it to serve everyone. The new world wanted to make it serve the few. Until that changed, the war would never end. We reached the dam as the sun climbed toward noon. The NCR was waiting, positioned exactly as our scouts had reported. General Oliver stood on the dam itself, surrounded by rangers and heavy troopers. Behind them, we could see the lights of New Vegas, indifferent to the violence about to unfold. Lanius raised his blade and gave the order to attack. The Legion surged forward with a roar that shook the ground, but it was different from previous attacks. The legionaries moved with precision and purpose rather than mindless fury. They fought to win, yes, but they fought consciously, aware of every blow they struck. The NCR met them with gunfire and grenades. Rangers picked off legionaries with sniper rifles. Heavy troopers held choke points with automatic weapons. The battle was brutal, chaotic, everything war had always been. But underneath the violence, I could feel something shifting. Graham did not fight. He walked onto the dam through the battle, and neither side could touch him. Bullets passed through the space where he stood without hitting him. Explosions erupted around him without leaving a mark. He moved like smoke, like light, like an idea that could not be killed. He reached the center of the dam and raised his hands. The fighting did not stop, but it slowed. Legionaries and NCR soldiers alike found themselves hesitating, watching the burned man standing in the place where two armies collided. Graham spoke, and his voice carried over the gunfire and screams. He said this battle was a lie. Both sides were fighting for control of something that could not be controlled. The dam, the Mojave, the future itself. They were trying to impose order through violence, when the only true order came from choice. He said every person fighting on this dam had the power to stop, to lay down their weapons, to choose a different path. Some did. I watched legionaries lower their machetes and step back. I saw NCR troopers put down their rifles and simply stand there, trembling. Not many, but enough. Enough to prove that choice was possible, even in the middle of war. But most kept fighting, because stopping was harder than continuing, because momentum carried them forward, even when purpose failed, because changing direction required courage that most people did not have. Lanius fought his way to General Oliver. The two commanders faced each other across a pile of bodies and rubble. Lanius could have killed Oliver easily. The general was old, slower, less skilled, but Lanius did not strike. Instead, he asked Oliver a question. He asked if the NCR was worth dying for. Oliver responded with a question of his own. He asked if the Legion was worth killing for. The two men stared at each other, and in that moment, I saw recognition pass between them. They were both servants of systems that devoured them, both trapped in roles they could not escape, both aware that victory would solve nothing. Lanius lowered his blade and walked away. He ordered the Legion to withdraw. The Centurions were shocked, confused, but they obeyed. The monster of the East was retreating, and he was doing it by choice rather than defeat. Caesar watched Lanius withdraw and nodded. He raised his hand and gave the order for full retreat. The Legion pulled back from Hoover Dam, leaving the NCR in control of the territory, but bewildered by the sudden withdrawal. We had not lost. We had not won. We had simply chosen to stop fighting a battle that served no purpose beyond perpetuating itself. As the Legion retreated east, Graham remained on the dam. He stood there watching us go, his bandages streaming in the wind like flags. I knew I would never see him again, not in that form. But I also knew he would always be with the Legion, woven into our transformation, a fire that would burn until we had all become ash or gold. Caesar died 3 weeks later, not from the tumor, which remained gone, but from exhaustion. The effort of transforming the Legion, of managing the synthesis with Graham, of trying to build something that would outlast him, it had consumed the last of his strength. He died in his sleep, peaceful, surrounded by Lucius and his closest commanders. Lanius did not become the new Caesar. Instead, he established a council, 12 centurions representing different aspects of the Legion, different tribes, different philosophies. They would govern collectively, arguing and debating and slowly learning to make decisions without a single absolute authority. It was messy, it was slow, but it was evolution. The Legion began to change in ways large and small. Women were allowed to train as warriors if they chose. Literacy programs spread through the ranks. Slavery was not abolished immediately, but it was modified, made less brutal, with paths to earning freedom. The crucifixions stopped. The random massacres ended. We remained a military society, but one with purpose beyond conquest. I became one of the council members, not because I was the most loyal or the strongest, but because I had walked beside Graham and learned to ask questions. The Legion needed questioners, now more than it needed blind followers. Sometimes I visit the chamber Graham built beneath Fortification Hill. The machines still hum, screens still glow with data I cannot fully understand. I sit in the center where he once prayed, and I try to make sense of what happened. How one man, wrapped in bandages and pain, transformed an army through nothing but words and presence and the willingness to burn. I do not have all the answers. I am not sure Graham did either, but I understand now what he was trying to teach us, that change is not optional, that stagnation is death, that the only way to survive is to evolve, even when evolution is agonizing. That fire destroys, yes, but it also purifies, and sometimes purification is the only path to redemption. The Legion still exists. It is smaller now, less feared, more uncertain. We are no longer an unstoppable force of conquest. We are an experiment in conscious transformation. Some days I think we will succeed, that we will become the civilization Caesar dreamed of and Graham sanctified. Other days I think we are just delaying the inevitable, that the Legion is too damaged to ever be healed. But we are trying. That has to count for something. I have told you this story because someone needs to know what really happened. The official histories will say the Legion retreated from Hoover Dam due to strategic consideration. They will say Caesar died of illness, and his successor chose to consolidate rather than expand. They will not mention Graham. They will not speak of the burned prophet who walked through our camp and set our souls on fire. But I remember, and this testimony is my attempt to honor that memory, to acknowledge that transformation happened, that change is real, that even the most brutal army in the wasteland can choose to become something better. Joshua Graham returned to the Legion as the burned prophet, and he saved us by teaching us how to burn. If this story has kept you listening this far, and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that subscribe button. It tells me someone out there is still paying attention to warnings like these.